Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I've got a special conversation going on today about something that is not in the Great Lakes Basin, but I think it might hold some nice possibilities for the future work of all of us trying to protect the basin. I'm going to talk with Ms. Jodi Rose, Executive Director of the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, or IPC. Welcome, Jodi, and thanks for making the time to be here.
Thank you, Dan. I'm glad to be invited.
I really appreciate it. The Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake is a variety of faith traditions that are working to protect the Chesapeake watershed and help it thrive. And Jodi came to the IPC in 2013. Before that, she spent 15 years in environmental consulting, during which time she was an active member of her Catholic parish in the Indianapolis area. And we'll talk in a little bit about her own journey. But first, Jodi, can you talk about the work of the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, what the group is about?
Great. And thanks so much, Dan, for this invitation. So IPC works with congregations of any faith to engage them in watershed education and restoration. We're really trying to harness the collective impact that these private landowners can have on reducing stormwater pollution to the bay, as well as increasing tree canopy and native plantings, but then also helping them change the hearts and minds of their own members. There's only so many people on our staff, but if we are working with congregations, every one of those points of contact represent hundreds and potentially thousands of people that might be learning about stormwater and watershed stewardship for the first time, and what is causing some of the problems in the bay. And here in the Chesapeake watershed, the only source of pollution that is still increasing is stormwater pollution, which your audience probably already knows comes from stormwater runoff, developed areas. And so the reason it's still increasing is because we continue to develop. And it's not that we're advocating to not develop. We want people to see that there's other ways to do this. There's ways to retrofit your properties. There's ways to kind of return to balance. And so congregations, there's 5,000 of them in Maryland alone. They manage a lot of land. We still haven't even calculated all of the land that they manage. So there's a huge opportunity to really have an impact on that one source of pollution in the watershed that's still on the rise.
It's interesting you mentioned stormwater in particular because I just recently I talked with a person who is working with congregations in the Detroit area about doing projects around stormwater retention and green infrastructure kinds of projects with those. So when you talk to these faith communities, is there a surprise that that's what you want to talk about when you talk about trying to preserve the watershed? I think I'm guessing a lot of people don't immediately go to stormwater retention or dealing with stormwater as a big issue right away.
I think that's a great question. Usually when we're talking to them in a presentation format, they know they've asked us to come in and talk about how can they get involved with interfaith partners. And so I think there's a little bit of understanding. I will say, though, there are aha moments throughout our talks about what just the aggressiveness of what's happening, and the areas in which they can play a role. And a lot of people are still actually learning what a watershed is for the first time, and walking out of a meeting and saying, wow, I learned so much. I really didn't know about that, or I really need to rethink even my lawn at home. I didn't think about it as being a crop that didn't feed anything. So I think we are reaching people that are not normally listening to these things or reading up on these things. And it's not that they don't care, it's that they just didn't know. And so, I think that there's huge opportunities to just expose people to new ways of thinking.
When you talk to folks in a congregation, particularly say a new congregation you haven't worked with before, do you find the connection between working on issues around the watershed and the environment, that, that connection natural for folks to make to their faith or their faith tradition or their spirituality?
Um, it- yes, I do think that, and particularly here in the Chesapeake, I mean, there's water everywhere. Everybody probably on their regular morning walk walks by at least a creek. I mean, maybe parts of the cities, maybe not. In my neighborhood, I have a creek right here that we take our dog down by all the time. So I think people just in this neck of the woods have a more regular connection with water. So it's where they grew up in a lot of times, or they have their picnics for their neighborhood near it. I mean, it's just really a big part of their life. And then the closer and closer you get to the bay itself, the more and more that is a big piece of the culture. Um, so there's that. There's just the sense of place, but then there is the spiritual aspects, and we talk a lot about being in a watershed community. And the quote from Wendell Berry, I'm sure, do unto those downstream as you'd have those upstream do unto you. We talk about that a lot, and a lot of times they chuckle because they finally, it's at the end of the presentation and we can say, and now you know what that means, right? And they may not have in the beginning. And so there's that connectedness, that community connectedness. And then there's even another piece. The woman who was the first executive director, and I won't remember the exact quote, but she, would often say, we need to be able to get back into the river and baptize people. We need to be able to actually use this water in a sacred way. And we can't safely get into the water and touch it. People who need to supplement their diet can't do that safely from the rivers in our community. That's not giving glory to God. That is not what God intended. And so there's so many ways that we can really weave all of this back to our perspectives as people of faith and our moral responsibilities.
I love that image about, within the Christian tradition, at least, trying to say we need to use this river in order to baptize people. And I was talking with a woman who was involved in some stuff in northwestern Lower Peninsula of Michigan, and she talked about ritual, the importance of ritual for some of the work that she was doing. And I'm wondering, with the communities that you work with, it seems like there's two sides to this. There's the sort of the practical side of dealing with stormwater or whatever their practices are at that particular congregation, and then there's sort of the incorporating this into the spirituality or the faith life of the community. What are some examples that you've run across that you thought were kind of interesting with some of the communities that you work with in terms of doing that second part of how do we incorporate this into the spiritual life of the community?
Um, so lots of really interesting examples. We are often asked to come out or at least help somebody write a liturgy together for a blessing of a cistern or a blessing of a rain barrel or a rain garden. That happens a lot. We've got lots of great pictures of all sorts of spiritual leaders in their garb or not out there with their community, not only blessing the practice, but then teaching them how the practice works. We just recently, so we invite congregations to sign a pledge to really formalize their commitment. And in doing so, then we include them on our website, on our congregations page, and it's an interactive map so people can see who are all the congregations that are in this movement. And a congregation last weekend did, in pandemic times, a drive-by signing of their pledge. And so we hadn't really thought about, we ask for signatures from the leaders of the Green Team. We hadn't thought about encouraging them to get other members of their congregation to also sign it. And they did a beautiful thing where they put the pledge on a very large mat and everybody kind of drove up, got out of their car, signed their name and drove on. And I thought that was a really wonderful ritual to embody that commitment into the culture of the entire community, not just that one Green Team or that one ministry that was going to take that work forward. And then sometimes what we've done when we could be back in person and we're really trying to, maybe bless an entire community that isn't all of the same faith. And so we may be honoring some joint projects that they've been doing together, or the fact that they're all part of the watershed together. So we did this a couple years ago with a part of Baltimore called the Jones Falls Watershed. And what's really interesting about starts up the headwaters of the Jones Falls watershed are in some of the more affluent parts of Baltimore County, and Jones Falls in Baltimore Harbor, and obviously passes through parts of Baltimore City that are not nearly as affluent as parts of Baltimore County. So you have an entire watershed of so many different people, different faiths, different demographics connected together. And so we had about 16 or 17 congregations in the Jones to one water park. And we did this like kind of ritual blessing of that. And, there was a pledge signing. And then the other thing we do is we'll get little glass water bottles and ask people to bring water from where they're at. And we combine that and as a community, bless and allow everybody to take a little bit of that home. And they're part of that entire watershed together.
Oh, nice. Nice. So, talk a little bit about the different congregations that you in faith traditions that are part of the Interfaith Partnership. Where do you draw your folks from?
So it's hard to say if it's population, the greater part of the population is this religion or that religion, and that's, why these figures are like that. But the largest contingent of our footprint Episcopal churches, and then probably closely followed by Lutherans and Presbyterians. We do also have a healthy amount of Roman Catholic churches, as well as Jewish from all walks of, there's 4 primary groupings of Judaism in the United States. And then a handful of Muslim communities or Sikh communities, as well as a Native American community on the Eastern Shore that we're beginning to have some conversations with, Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Okay. And what's that been like trying to help these different people from all these different faith traditions come together on a project together? What have been some of the challenges and some of the joys of that?
Well, yeah, so challenges are that they all, a lot of our projects are still focused on the land that they own. And so coming together combined project it's often like they're, maybe working on a congregation, maybe. There's not a lot of shared land, right? So that's still kind of segregated in that way, and that the project installations are really, still very property centric. There have been a couple times when we've brought them together for more community-based tree planting and things like that. And the joys in that is, really just seeing how united and similar we really are, and we're all reaching toward the same things. And everybody wants, everybody thinks about the youth and the future. And that's like another unifying thing across all religions, is just this really deep commitment to trying to leave this place better than the trajectory that we're on right now, for the sake of the young that will inherit what we leave behind. People love their children. They always have, and they always will. And that is something that is absolutely the same among all faith traditions.
So, how did the Interfaith Partnership get started? How did the organization? What's the sort of the origin story, if you will?
Yeah, the origin story is that there was a group of Presbyterians that went to a conference by the National Council of Churches, a Holy Waters conference. I believe it was in the mid 2000s, and continued to have conversations about why are we not talking about the Chesapeake Bay from the pulpit? We're hearing about it in the news, and we know that there's different organizations in our community that are working on this, but why are our churches not working on it? And that was a group of Presbyterians from Baltimore. I don't know if I said that, but from there, they really just wanted to try to get as many other churches, and not just Presbyterians, to sign a covenant. They called it a covenant at the time. And so that's kind of how things grew. They wanted to just get this on the mind frame of other religions, other leaders, I should say, and get them to, sign this covenant that they were going to talk about this more and try to do things in their communities. Around 2011, then they become a little bit more formalized, and they got some seed money from a foundation, the Campbell Foundation, who continues to support us very generously ever since. And they brought on a part-time executive director, and they began to really become formal. And then in 2013, I joined, the other executive director left. And we began to try to create programming to move beyond signing a covenant, and taking that action. And what we found was there was a lot of interest in taking action. There was a lot of interest and eagerness to do things, but churches and congregations just really felt, stymied. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have the technical know-how. They didn't have the grant funding. So there was a lot of need to ramp up resources and the pragmatic, as you say, the pragmatic side of things. So there was a really strong, spiritual and moral foundation. And then I think, we began to shift into practical application of that. So, and the rest is history. We've just been throwing spaghetti at the wall ever since and seeing what sticks.
Like so many of us, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Don't look behind the black curtain. There is no Wizard of Oz back there.
well, well, so you're working with a big area, lots of different people, lots of different congregations. I don't know how many states, like 6, 7 states you're in, plus the District of Columbia. So it's a wide area. When we talked a few weeks ago, you had mentioned that um, around the time that I had contacted you, you had heard from somebody, I think it was Maine, perhaps, who was saying, "Hey, we should have an interfaith partnership like this up in our neck of the woods," and I had called you about that. So, in terms of, I'm asking this as the perspective of somebody who's cares about the Great Lakes Basin, the Great Lakes watershed. Do you see something like this being repeatable in other parts of the country? And if so, what are some lessons, some wisdom that you can impart from your experience of doing it there?
Hmm. So I definitely think there is something very profound about understanding where you are in your watershed. As you know, I was born and raised in Illinois, and so I didn't grow up around a lot of water. I've only lived in Maryland for 10 years. Water was going into Lake Michigan or periodically going camping. It wasn't in my backyard or, all around the way it is out here. But I still think that we can still teach people about this, and I think it just really gives people a sense of ownership of the things that they can control. I think there are so many environmental challenges that are, we are constantly reminded are existential threats, and it can be really overwhelming. And I think one of the things we try to do in our conversations with people is remind people you can't save the whole planet, but you can save your corner of it. And you're kind of like, you have to. Like, if you don't, it's irresponsible. So you do have to step up, and you have to do something in your little corner of the world. And if everybody did it, then we're going to be okay. And so just reminding people of their own circle of influence. And I think that's the beauty of framing things in a watershed, and taking action to really restore your watershed is you know that place. You treasure that place. You love that place. And we're not going to take care of the things, that quote, right? We're not going to take care of the things we don't treasure, or we don't love, or we don't know. And there's something really important about that. And so, but the other thing I want to say too about, you said we're throughout the watershed. We really aren't yet. 8 years in, and we're still only in Maryland. We're starting to try to build out some programming in Lancaster, and a little bit in DC. So lesson learned to the second half of your question is start small. Don't try to be everywhere and an inch deep. Try to be in a smaller location, and really build relationships and build out from there. I think this is really about relationship building. It's our outreach coordinators will tell me that Yes, they can go out to informational community events and have their informational table and try to get the word out about all the work that they do, but really it's spending the 20 minutes on the phone with elder so and so and having that conversation and just really building up that relationship and that trust that makes a difference. And that's a long game. And we just have to all be prepared, and our funders and our supporters and our donors need to be prepared that this is a long game. But to do it right, that's what's at the heart of it, is relationships.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about your own story. Talk a little bit about how you have a background working in environmental issues before you came to Interfaith Partners. Um, how did you make that connect? What drew you to that work in the first place, and then how did you make that connection for yourself with your own faith life and spiritual journey?
So I grew up at an era where we were learning about recycling in high school. And, that give you a little insight into my age. But so that was, this was there is really something to be said about starting with the young people. I mean, teaching things at schools. I mean, I was the one that brought that home to my family, but it didn't feel weird to bring that home. It was what I was learning at school. So I am part of a generation that I think was exposed to environmental challenges at an earlier age. But I think also I fell in love with the earth at an early age too. I come from a big family. We camped a lot. We couldn't stay in hotels. And so all of my cherished memories of being around my big family are outside. I think it just over time, this has been my calling. So when I went to school, I was trying to get into an environmental field. I had my own little way of getting there. And I did end up as in a consulting role with a consulting firm. And eventually kind of like branched off and did my own independent consulting as well as I was raising kids and things like that. And so, I think women reinvent themselves a lot in life. I think we're forced to by nature. Every time there's a new child or a new phase for that child, we're constantly redefining who we are. And so it's not unusual for me to have so many different stops on the bus. And one of those stops was really kind of challenging me as to whether or not my work as an independent consultant in environmental consulting was really giving glory to God in the way that I felt I needed to. And I did kind of have a watershed moment at some point in my life where I was driving out to a site visit to do one of these liability assessments. And as I often was asked to do, was these site assessments were in very oppressed areas. And one of these, days I just was sitting at a stoplight waiting to go through, and I'm in a very poor neighborhood. And I know that no matter what I do with this project I'm working on for this consultant, none of that money that's going to change hands is going to help this neighborhood, is going to heal anything that I see around me. And I see this old man walk in front of me with his cane and disheveled, and who knows the last time he ate. And I just sat there and cried. And my God just said, that's not, this is not what I have in mind for you. I need you somewhere else. And I just thought to myself, I really want to work for him. I don't want to be working for the big corporations. I just wanted to work for the people that are suffering from lack of access to green space and lack of clean water. And so that began another shift in the bus route, right? And so it was a journey to try to figure out, how do I maneuver myself into the work that has become my career. But it started with volunteering at my Catholic church and trying to, we built a community garden there, and we invited refugees in to share from the bounty. We did an environmental fair. This was a pretty conservative, all white Catholic church in Indianapolis. And so there was a little bit of resistance to this, and I learned a lot through that. But I also had a very supportive pastor who, if I didn't, I don't think any of this would have happened. But that was a really fun thing for me and just energized me so much. And I realized that at heart, I was a community organizer. I really just wanted to be out there with people. And so that helped me kind of figure out where I wanted to go next, and eventually landed at IPC.
Wow, it's a great story. It's interesting to me how so many people involved in this kind of work have those moments. May not be just one single one, but it's either one or a collection of a few that kind of steer them in that direction. I hadn't planned on asking you this, but you mentioned that so many women have to go through this series of inventing themselves or reinventing themselves as life goes along. And as we're talking about water, and you mentioned the experience of women, and I'm thinking about some of the indigenous communities I've talked to where women, it's the role of women to care for the water. And I'm just curious, the people you see involved in the Interfaith Partnership or Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, are, are, are most of them women? Do you notice a trend? If you don't, that's fine. I was just curious as you said that.
I don't notice them in terms of the congregational representatives. So I think like our target audience, I don't know, maybe slightly, but it's never struck me like, oh my gosh, everybody in this room is female. I don't think I've ever had that. I'm thinking even just of the event we had last night, and there were a fair amount of men there. So I'm not sure I could say that. I do think in the nonprofit field, it's largely uh, women who are the paid staff.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know that that translates to the same thing you were asking. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's not a big deal. It's just when you said that, it made me,
yeah.
yeah.
No,
Well,
I'm going to think about that because that's interesting.
yeah. Well, and it may be a reflection of, and I don't want to, this is more of a generic comment than it is. Obviously, I don't know your situation, but in terms of religious congregational leadership, I wonder if it's a reflection of to some degree of that too, of being more men than women. It's a lot of times in those roles. So, yeah,
Hmm.
interesting. And then finally, I guess I want to ask you, where do you see IPC going in the future? What's you mentioned trying to branch out into some other areas within the watershed. Are there other things that you're hoping to do as you move down the road?
Well, we are just in the final year of a strategic plan, and we are developing our strategic plan for 2022 and beyond. So I don't have any good ideas, and I think that that's something we're all going to be talking about, the board and the staff, and we're doing all sorts of stakeholder interviews. Um, I think we I think we feel what we're doing is really badly needed, and we just really want to scale this up in a way that's sustainable. I think there's some opportunities in Maryland there's some things shifting here in terms of valuing the installations in a marketplace, in like a credit marketplace. And I don't know how relevant this would be to people across the country, but it is something that's happening here in the Chesapeake, where the stormwater reduction credit could have value on a marketplace. And I think that there's huge opportunities for congregations to actually be compensated, not just have the project installed for free, but actually get some money directly to offset their other budget costs, because they are putting in such a valuable project for the common good. And IPC is really on the forefront of trying to unravel what that means, and dissect, maybe not unravel, we just understand what that means and how to help congregations really take advantage of that. And I think that's definitely one thing in the future. But other big picture vision and ideas, I'm going to leave that for the staff and the board to collectively think about.
Sure, sure. Well, we'll wrap it up there, but I wish you luck in the strategic planning. I mean, that's a big step to, kind of envision where you're going to be down the road. So I hope that goes well.
Right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time, Jodi. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. This has been fun.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.